essay is based on my PhD research and is now a book project that I'm working on. The argument I want to make is that in looking at the responses of states on the edges of Europe, we have to take into account their EU membership, their membership in the European Union, and their geopolitical position within the European Union. And I look at Malta and Cyprus in particular, and the argument I make is that these states have used non-material power in order to construct a crisis around the issue of irregular immigration. And immigration detention becomes a significant part of that construction of a crisis, so it's both symbolic of the crisis as well as reinforcing that crisis. So a lot of the questions that spurred my interest in this area came from, were inspired by, if you like, this incident in 2007. There was a small boat of about 27 sub-Saharan migrants, all men, mostly from Somalia, that left Libya and was traveling across the Mediterranean. They ran into trouble pretty early on and started to drift in the Mediterranean. And after about 6 days of drifting at sea, the boat started to sink, but they were close to this tuna pen, and they managed to clamber onto this tuna pen, which the tuna pens, they've become quite ubiquitous in the Mediterranean, and they have these narrow walkways around them, which are only about 18 inches wide. And the tuna pen was being pulled by a Maltese trawler. The Maltese, it was a small crew, 5-member crew. The Maltese captain, when he realized this was happening, he gave them water, but he wouldn't allow them onto the boat. He cited security concerns for not allowing them onto the boat. He also refused to tow them back to Malta, citing concerns around the loss of profit, because tuna is a profitable enterprise, and so he said he would lose money if he towed them back to Malta. So what he did do was call the Maltese Armed Forces, the maritime squadron that's in charge of search and rescue in the area. The Maltese Armed Forces, the Maltese government, in its turn, called Libya and Italy and said it's your responsibility. So they were actually still in Libyan search and rescue area here, but they were physically closer to the island of Lampedusa, the Italian island of Lampedusa. So this is a reoccurring issue in the Mediterranean, where Malta's search and rescue area is actually quite large, covers most of the central Mediterranean, and the island of Lampedusa, the Italian island, is actually inside that search and rescue area. So Malta called Italy and Libya, said, you guys need to deal with it, and there was this political wrangling that took place between the three countries for about 3 days while the migrants remained on the tuna pen, on this small walkway. Eventually, Italy capitulated and went and rescued the migrants and allowed them to disembark in Lampedusa. So this got me thinking, how did policies develop to a point in Malta where transferring responsibility for 27 men who were in a very dangerous situation, transferring responsibility to another country was more important than saving their lives? How did we get to a situation where these people's lives, they've been so dehumanized that that tuna profit was more important than saving their lives? And kind of more broadly, how did these state relations shape these migration flows, and how did the migration flows shape the relations between these states in the Mediterranean? So I think part of the answer is, part of the answer to these questions has to do with the evolution of migration and asylum policies at the EU level. So what we have seen at the EU level is this movement of migration controls and asylum responsibilities towards the external border. So first you have the Schengen Agreement, which relaxed internal migration controls, but in compensation sought to fortify the external border. The Dublin Convention a few years later said that asylum seekers had to apply for asylum in the first country of arrival in the EU. And because most asylum seekers can't access legal channels and are forced to enter the Union irregularly, most enter through member states along the external border. And to supplement the Dublin Convention, the Eurodac was set up in 2003, and the Eurodac is a database of fingerprints, so all asylum seekers in the EU are fingerprinted, and those fingerprints are put in the Eurodac, as well as people entering the EU across the external border without authorization. So people who enter irregularly are also fingerprinted and put into this database. And the database and the Dublin Convention were set up ostensibly to stop so-called asylum shopping, so to stop someone being able to apply for asylum in Greece, and then if they got refused, apply for asylum again in Sweden, say. It was very much pushed by northern member states who at this time were seeing quite large amounts of asylum application made in those countries. And I think all these three together, what we see is this, what I've called the distalization of migration controls and asylum responsibility. So I use this term distalization. I use the anatomical word distal to mean far from the core. And I use this term distalization to differentiate it from externalization. So there has been this internal movement within the European Union of migration controls and asylum responsibility. And it's, a lot of scholars have talked about externalization. Christina Boswell, Sandra Lavenax, Jennifer Heinemann and Alison Mounts have talked about externalization and these new forms that states are engaging in of trying to stop asylum seekers and migrants from arriving on their territories. And I think it's linked, right? This distalization effect in the European Union encourages member states along the external border to externalize these controls. And what we see also in this history of distalization are these moments where states, northern states in particular, interpret migration flows as a crisis in order to justify this distalization process. So in the 80s and 90s, as I said, France and Germany in particular saw really high numbers of asylum applicants. And in the late 90s, there were flows of Kurdish refugees who arrived in Germany. And in these instances were used to justify the Dublin Convention in particular. These Kurdish refugee flows were used to justify the Dublin Convention and the need to not allow this kind of movement, not allow these refugees to be able to move through Europe in this way. And you see this real mistrust within Europe, which again reoccurs, this mistrust between member states, in particular northern states being mistrustful of southern member states' abilities to control migration and to stop these kind of flows. So this type of distalization, this movement of migration control has been pretty successful actually. So here you see in the turquoise in 1996, almost 60% of asylum applicants across the EU were made in France and Germany. So this turquoise line is the asylum applications made in France and Germany. And you can see after 1997, when the Dublin Convention came into effect, there's this sharp decrease in asylum applications in those countries. And in parallel, you see an increase in asylum applications along the external border. So the blue line is the external border, and then it's disaggregated into the southern border in green and the eastern border in orange. So how have states on the southern periphery, along the external border, how have states responded to this responsibility? So I look at Cyprus and Malta in particular. This is a reminder of where Cyprus and Malta are. They're both small member states, two of the smallest member states in the European Union. They both joined the Union in 2004. And both of these states saw, at this time, around 2004, when they joined the European Union and when their borders were being redefined as not just national borders, but also external borders of the EU. At this time, you saw them both experiencing an increase in migration flows. So these are the unauthorized boat arrivals in Malta between 1998 and 2013. So you can see between 2001 and 2002, this pretty significant increase in migration flows at that time. Other scholars, Derek Luderbeck, for instance, Hein de Haas also has made this argument that you saw this increase in migration flows in the Mediterranean at this time that was replicated in Italy as well. You saw this because there was an increase in migration controls along the Spanish border and the Canary Islands and West Africa. So that increase in migration controls pushed migration flows towards Central Africa through Libya and up across the central Mediterranean. And you can see since about 2002, the numbers have been fairly similar. There was this big drop in 2010, and that was because of the Italian agreement with Libya. They signed this treaty on friendship in 2010 that allowed Italy to push migrants and refugees back from the high seas to Libya. So they would intercept boats, often in conjunction with Libyan officials, and return them to Libya. And this was subsequently in 2011, I believe, condemned by the European Court of Human Rights as contrary to the principle of non-refoulement. So that stopped, and the numbers increased again, and then we had the crisis in Libya, the revolution in Libya, which also added to that increase. Most of these people arriving, so they come from Libya, they depart from Libya, but they're not Libyan. Most of them are sub-Saharan African, and the vast majority are Somali and Eritrean. So the vast majority are refugees, actually. Over 90% apply for asylum, and Malta has very high recognition rates. Up to 80% get some form of protection. Mostly they get subsidiary forms of protection and not full refugee status, but that's a political decision, which I can talk about more in the question and answer session. Also, this year we've seen a decrease again. There's only been about 300 arrivals this year, and that's because of the Italian, what they call a humanitarian military mission, which they call Mare Nostrum, and so they've been very active at rescuing people this year. They've rescued over 150,000 people at sea just this year, and that's just ended that mission. So in Cyprus, you see kind of a similar increase around 2002, 2003. The situation in Cyprus in terms of migration is slightly more complex, and the numbers on irregular arrivals aren't as good. They range kind of from 6,000 to 45,000. But you can see the increase in asylum applications at the time as a proxy. The increase at the time was thought to be because of the US-led invasion in Iraq, that produce refugee flows. Also, Cyprus is quite close to that area, to the Middle East. And there also seemed to be an issue of Pakistani and Bangladeshi students applying for asylum because it was the only way they could get access to the labor market. So students didn't have access to the labor market, but asylum seekers did. So these students were applying for asylum to get access to the labor market. So the government actually then allowed students access to the labor market. So you see a drop-off after that. So these two states are similar in lots of ways. They're both small, they're both on the edges of Europe. They're both also separated from the mainland, which becomes important. So they don't have a mainland like Lampedusa does with Italy or the Canary Islands do with Spain. There are also important differences, obviously, between the two countries. So the first is that Cyprus has recruited more foreign laborers than Malta has. So Cyprus, since the early 1990s, had a labor migration scheme set up. And until recently, until the crisis there, about 25% of the workforce was made up by labor migrants, by foreigners. The biggest portion of those labor migrants are domestic migrants, which you can see here hanging out along the beach. And these domestic migrants are on visas that are tied to their employers, so are very vulnerable to losing their status. So the migration situation in terms of irregular migration in Cyprus is more complex in the sense that you do have some people entering without authorization, but they don't come by boat. They tend to come to the northern part of Cyprus. So Cyprus remains a divided island, so they come to the north and then cross over the Green Line into the southern part of the island. But a vast majority of people without status in Cyprus are actually people who came in on visas and who have lost their status for one reason or another. The other big difference, as I just mentioned, is the fact that Cyprus remains divided, and this dominates, understandably, the political scene. So whereas migration has been really at the forefront of Malta's relationship with the EU, in Cyprus, the migration issues get subsumed under this issue of the division of the island, and securitized issues around population and territory and sovereignty that have to do with that division. So both these islands are small and relatively weak players within the Union, within the European Union. So in my work, what I look at is how in the absence of material power resources, so power based on their economy, military, territory, population, all of which are quite small, these states have turned to non-material power resources like networks, knowledge, symbolic capital, and moral authority in order to try and attract more support from the European Union in terms of migration and asylum issues. And in particular, they've pushed for what they call burden sharing. So what they mean by that is the relocation of refugees from Malta and Cyprus to other EU member states. And they've employed this non-material power in part through these discourses of exceptionalism. So both states have constructed themselves as exceptional within the European Union in terms of migration based on a number of issues. So demographics and geography play a big role in both Malta and Cyprus. So both states have stressed that they're small and that they have a limited population, and that in relation to that they're experiencing large flows of migration at this time. As we've seen, the numbers are not large in absolute terms. They're quite small, actually, compared to other countries in absolute terms. But Malta and Cyprus both stress that per capita, these arrivals or the asylum applications per capita are significant. And again, there's some political use of the numbers here, because they are, if you look at the numbers per capita, they are at the top of the lists within the EU as well as within broader developed states. But if you look at the numbers per capita per GDP, they fall off the list completely. So there's definitely this political use of the numbers. Malta has stressed this in particular, and it has also pointed to the fact that it has one of the highest population densities in the world, and this is seen to amplify the effects of arrivals. Geography also for both of them, so they've both stressed that they're on the edge of Europe, and that they're close to these turbulent areas. So Cyprus often points to the Middle East as a turbulent area that's producing lots of these flows, and Malta points to Libya as allowing these flows across the Mediterranean. So this is a quote from a Cypriot member of the European Parliament, who says the problem of illegal migration is becoming serious on this island because of its small size and its population. And this is across the board. Everyone I spoke to said something like this. So again, Malta tends to be at the forefront of this, the argument that they're in this exceptional position based on demographics and geography, whereas Cyprus has also emphasized the division of the island. So the permanent secretary of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Cyprus said the biggest problem is, of course, Turkey, because 90% of the illegals come through the dividing line, through Turkey, essentially. So there's a lot of emphasis put on the fact that the EU member state, the government, the Greek Cypriot government doesn't control the northern part of the island, and so can't control the migration flows into that part. And so these discourses of exceptionalism have been used to construct a crisis around the issue of migration and asylum. And it's very much based on this idea, on the numbers of being kind of overwhelmed by these numbers of migrants and refugees. There are also really important assumptions, I think, made in this construction of a crisis. So the first is that there was this mythical homogeneous society of the past before these migrants started arriving. So the permanent secretary in the Ministry for Justice and Home Affairs in Cyprus says, until a few years ago, maybe 15 years, we were a pretty homogeneous society with very few foreigners. So the presence of so many non-Cypriots among us coming from diverse origins and traditions, religions and civilizations presents a serious challenge to society, especially a small insular place like Cyprus, which also happens to be geographically remote in comparison to the rest of the European Union. And this is similarly echoed by Maltese politicians and is a real rewriting of history. Both Malta and Cyprus have been colonized by various powers across their histories. They're both islands that have a history of migration, basically people coming and going, and maybe especially in Cyprus, this kind of rewriting of history and portraying the population as homogeneous is particularly dangerous given the history of the division of the island. The other assumption in this crisis rhetoric is that EU membership has resulted in more responsibility for migration. So the Cypriot government official, in a very blasé manner, talks about sending asylum seekers, putting asylum seekers back in a boat and sending them back to where they came from. Malta also talks about how previous to membership in the European Union, they would help boats, migrants in distress, but then allow them onto Italy. And EU membership has created this responsibility that they didn't have before. So basically, this adds up into both states constructing this crisis based on this portrayal of them as weak states overwhelmed by these migration flows that they can't control. And in doing so, I think this construction of a crisis allows them to deflect responsibility both towards the EU, but also to these other states like Libya and Turkey as kind of the reasons for these migration flows. So what has happened nationally in terms of this construction of crises? I'm going to focus on Malta just in terms of time here, but I'm happy to talk about the detention situation in Cyprus as well. It's slightly different, but I'm happy to talk about that in the question and answer session. So on a national level, this kind of exceptionalism, these discourses of exceptionalism based on the number of people arriving have been used to justify deterrent policies like immigration detention in Malta. So immigration detention in Malta is a mandatory immigration detention policy of up to 18 months. So all migrants and refugees who arrive on the island without authorization are immediately put into detention, and they remain for up to 18 months in detention. Asylum seekers are released after 12 months if their asylum claim is still pending at that time, and successful asylum claimants are released once their claim is successful, and that usually takes up to 6 months at the minute, though it depends on the backlog. It's also, so this 18-month detention policy is the most severe in Europe across the European Union. And it's been condemned both for its length and its conditions by advocacy organizations for the last decade or more. The European Court of Human Rights in 2012 and 2013 ruled against Malta on the issue of immigration detention 3 times. So they found violations of the right to liberty, of the right to an effective remedy, and the prohibition of inhuman and degrading treatment. And they concluded that Malta's immigration detention policy was a defective national system hindering human rights protection. So despite this criticism, immigration detention in Malta enjoys bipartisan support across both major political parties, and is justified in the context of this immigration crisis. So the Minister for Foreign Affairs said the message needs to be received by everyone that entering Malta illegally will not go unpunished. And the detention, this is another senior official in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who said the detention policy is good to persuade illegal migrants that they have to go home. It's good that they can contact their relatives and say, listen, don't come to Malta because it's terrible here. So there's this explicit use of detention as a deterrent, even though there's very little evidence that it works as a deterrent. So nobody I spoke to knew about Malta's detention policy before they arrived, and this has been echoed by other reports. Human Rights Watch did a report on Maltese detention in 2012, where they also said nobody we spoke to knew about Maltese detention policy before they arrived. And so what I argue is that this immigration detention policy is symbolic of the crisis. So governments justify the immigration detention policy by referring to this crisis of migration, but it also reinforces the crisis, this constructed crisis around migration. And Alison Mounts and Nancy Heemstra have talked about in an interesting article they've written on chaos and crisis around immigration, how states mobilize chaos and crisis in order to create these exceptional moments and expand their geopolitical and sovereign reach. So, have they been successful in how has it gone for Malta and Cyprus in terms of trying to influence asylum and refugee policies in this manner in the European Union? So I think what we see is them being relatively successful at some level. So I'm going to talk about 4 different areas in which they've had an impact, a varying impact, but an impact. So the first is the European Pact on Immigration and Asylum, which was adopted in 2008. And Malta in particular, Cyprus kind of plays this supporting role at the EU level. So Malta takes the lead on these issues, and Cyprus plays this supporting role. So Malta, with Cyprus's help, really lobbied hard for the inclusion of this statement in the European Pact on Immigration and Asylum about member states facing specific and disproportionate pressures on their national asylum systems, due in particular to their geographical and demographic situation. And this is language that then gets reproduced in subsequent EU directives and policies, this idea of states facing disproportionate pressures due to their geographic and demographic situations. The pact also called for there to be more solidarity with these member states, and in particular, the pact actually talks about explicitly the movement of refugees from these countries to other EU member states, but all on a voluntary basis, so nothing more than just a voluntary basis. The second area is the European Asylum Support Office. So this was an agency that was set up by the EU in 2010, and there was a bidding process for the seat of this office. And Malta, Cyprus, and Bulgaria all bid for the seat. Malta was ultimately successful, and its bid was all about how they were facing a crisis situation in terms of migration and asylum, and how the EU should show solidarity with them and give them this seat. The office actually doesn't, I don't know how much, it's more symbolic, I think. I don't know how much the office actually helps Malta. So mostly what they do is information gathering on countries of origin. They have had some missions to Greece in the face of large asylum flows there, but it was mostly a symbolic win for Malta, I think. The third area is the Long-Term Residence Directive Amendment. So in 2008, there was an amendment suggested to this long-term residence directive, whereby the long-term residence directive says if you've been resident in a country for 5 years continuously, you should have access to permanent residency. The amendment was to extend that to refugees and people with international protection. So previously, refugees didn't have access to this directive. So in 2008 it was proposed, and Malta and Cyprus both vetoed this directive. But that was under previous unanimity rules. So the rules changed in between, and the EU went on voting on these issues from unanimity to qualified majority voting. So in 2011, the amendment was proposed again, and this time it passed, even though Malta and Cyprus again voted against it, but under the new qualified majority voting rules, it passed anyway. The last area is interesting presently, the kind of issues around this continue, and they speak to this tuna pen incident I mentioned at the beginning. So the Schengen Borders Code in 2010, there was an amendment proposed to the Schengen, there was an amendment passed to the Schengen Border Code, which was about disembarkation, about where migrants who were rescued at sea would be disembarked. Italy, in the kind of lead up, the negotiation to this amendment, Italy was maintaining that migrants should be disembarked in the coordinating state, so the search and rescue state. Whoever's search and rescue area it was, that state should be responsible for disembarkation. So in the Mediterranean, that means it would be Malta. Malta, on the other hand, was saying, no, it should be the nearest safe port. And not the coordinating state, which is more often than not Lampedusa, the Italian island of Lampedusa in the Mediterranean. So this wrangling went on, and Italy was ultimately successful, and the amendment said that the coordinating state would have primary responsibility for disembarkation, but in cases of exceptions, they could be disembarked in the nearest safe port. So that passed, but then shortly afterwards, the European Parliament lodged a complaint about the amendment with the European Court of Justice. And this complaint was spearheaded by one of Malta's members of the European Parliament, Simon Busuttil, his name was. So he spearheaded this complaint within the European Parliament that was lodged with the European Court of Justice that basically was about them not having consulted the European Parliament enough on this amendment, and the European Court of Justice eventually annulled the amendment in 2012, so they were successful at that. In this year, in May, I believe there's been a new amendment passed, which if people are interested in, I can talk about that. So, I think in terms of successes, I mean, those were particular successes that Malta and Cyprus have had. I think more broadly what they have done is managed to broaden this notion of solidarity within the European Union. So previously, solidarity was seen primarily as a financial transfer. We'll give you money, and that's our form of solidarity. They have really worked hard in trying to expand the notion of solidarity to also include these relocation schemes. And Malta actually had won a pilot relocation scheme in 2009. They also continue to get a lot of money from the EU through the EU funds for solidarity and management of migration flows. And they've been really good at agenda setting. So this is a Maltese politician saying we are punching above our weight. But EU officials as well recognize, when I interviewed EU officials, they recognized that Malta was setting the agenda in terms of migration issues in the Mediterranean at the EU level. So despite these successes, this construction of a crisis is not unproblematic on a number of levels. So there are some contradictions in the positions that Malta and Cyprus take that I think weaken their position within the EU. So first, they're simultaneously interpreting the migration situation as a security issue, as we need to increase migration controls, and as a humanitarian issue, as we are carrying this large so-called burden. They really play the moral authority card of look at all the asylum seekers we process and we host in our countries. Similarly, they're portraying themselves as vulnerable to these flows, yet indispensable to the EU in terms of migration control. And so I think this is a question about long-term effectiveness. And in 2010, when I did interviews with officials at the EU, there was already in the Commission and in the Council, there was already this kind of crisis fatigue. They were sort of, in 2010, if you'll remember, Malta had a real dip in the numbers. And so they were sort of saying, you know, like, still it's a crisis, even though there's a dip. So there's a question about long-term effectiveness, I think. Most importantly, this emphasis on deterrent measures has come at a cost to integration measures. So the Maltese government on Monday just announced that next year it's going to announce an integration policy. So this is 13 years after the increase in flows, and there has been no integration policy up until, well, hopefully next year. And the deterrent, the emphasis on deterrence has really serious consequences in terms of migrant deaths at sea. So this is a map by Olivier Clochard mapping mapping migrant deaths. And as you can see, they're kind of concentrated around the periphery of Europe. And this year only, this is from the IOM, 75% of migrant deaths across the world have occurred in the Mediterranean. So I think what you see in the Mediterranean with Cyprus and Malta is their EU membership creating this incentive to treat migration as a crisis. And so they've created this kind of ambivalent relationship with irregular immigration. On the one hand, the emphasis is on deterring these flows now, but it's also these flows that have put them on the political map in terms of being in the European Union. And so I think at least the threat of irregular immigration is politically useful and powerful for them. Thank you.